Good afternoon from India because it's an afternoon in India. I know many of you have joined from different time zones. Welcome you all. It is an absolute privilege to welcome all of you to this critical session on great power competition in the Indo-Pacific. From the beginning, I must thank and congratulate my dear friend Dr. Pramod Jaiswal and his team for organizing such an important conference. Very well done. Now, coming to the theme, Indo-Pacific region encompassing the vast expanse from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific has emerged as a focal point for international politics in the 21st century. With its strategic waterways, dynamic economies, and diverse geopolitical interest, the Indo-Pacific is not merely a geographical construct, but a theater where global power dynamics are being redefined every day. Today, as we delve into the nuances of great power competition in this region, we must address the complex interplay of national interest, alliances, and regional aspirations. On one hand, United States, EU, they continue to uphold their vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific, emphasizing democratic values, rule of law, and the freedom of navigation and other aspects as well. On the other hand, China asserts its ambitions through initiatives like the Belt and Road, the militarization of the South China Sea, and its growing economy and military influence. So in this competitive landscape, we also witness the rise of middle powers, India, Japan, and Australia, among others. Each of them shaping regional security and economic frameworks in ways that reflect their strategic priorities. Meanwhile, some other players, some other actors like ASEAN and Pacific Island nations, they also strive to assert their agency amidst these competing influences. So against this background, our session today may seek to explore some of the key questions which will be relevant for the discussion. First, how are the strategies of the great powers impacting the stability and prosperity of the Indo-Pacific region? Secondly, what roles do alliances, partnerships such as Quad or the AUKUS they play in balancing these power dynamics? Last but not the least, how do smaller nations navigate this competitive environment without compromising their sovereignty or economic growth? The stakes could not be higher because the Indo-Pacific is not only just a strategic chessboard, but a microcosm of different challenges and opportunities that define our globalized world. Right, from ensuring freedom of navigation to addressing climate change, fostering inclusive economic growth, and mitigating different kind of security risks. So I look forward to the insights and perspectives from our esteemed panelists as we examine these pivotal issues. I look forward to a stimulating Q&A discussion as well. Just to remind you that, remind you gently that you are being given 10 minutes for the presentation, and I have been asked by the organizers to be very strict with this time limits. So without any further may I now request our first panelist, Dr. Roger Kangas, to present his viewpoints. Dr. Roger Kangas is an academic dean at Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies, United States. So, Dr. Kangas, this virtual floor is all yours now. Over to you. I think Dr. Kangas has not joined yet. May I request Dr. Alexey Kupriyanov to present his viewpoints. Dr. Alexey Kupriyanov is head of the Center of the Indo-Pacific Region, Institute of World Economy and International Relations, Russia. So, Dr. Kupriyanov, over to you.
Thank you very much, dear Chair. Many thanks to organizers for the invitation. First of all, I have to apologize for two things because I will have to take my leave quite soon since it's Sunday and day off here, and I have a fatherly responsibility to my kids. And second, I'm afraid my speech will emerge somewhat from the thematic section. Actually, I'm a big fan of the history of maritime rivalry and military conflict, but today I will try to play devil's advocate because I'm not sure that we have anything like real rivalry between great powers in the Indo-Pacific. I think that it's a classic example of applying a familiar formula to a fundamentally different phenomenon, and it can lead to dangerous post-sledging. I'm not a supporter of political realism, I'm rather a constructivist, and I will try to consider the issue from this point of view. So some theory for the beginning. I would like to remind that the very idea of rivalry between nations is relatively new and is associated with the late modern era. Before that, so it was kings and rulers who competed, not nations as powers. And this is important because often the desired outcome of this rivalry was the ruler. So for the ruler was the change of comparative status, not the abstract balance of power. And in addition to status, so territorial acquisitions, of course, were important because in those days it was direct taxation that helped fill the treasury. And plus, the larger the population you have, the larger the pool of recruits. And this is important because so due to jure per gros bataillon. As mercantilism spread, trading rights also began to matter, but for a long time they remained quite secondary. After monarchies were replaced by republics and democracies in the late modern period, we found ourselves in a quite strange situation because, so if the question of status was clear, what we spoke when we spoke of ruler and his rights, then what does the status of the democratic nation mean? What determines it, and what does the status practically give in general? So the idea that the goal of conflict is territorial expansion has changed as well because direct taxation of the population is no longer the only means of replenishing the treasury, and the quality and skills of populations, the state's place in the production value chains, and so monetary policy are more important than the pure number of people. And moreover, the acquisition of new territories is now considered as negative sign and is avoided unless it concerns important strategic points. So finally, trade rights are not so important now either because the era of mercantilism is gone. The current economy is mainly free trader economy, in fact. And despite all borders and barriers, and a typical example is that FDI is considered an important driver of economic development. And this is a huge difference compared to the era of rivalry of past centuries. And what it means to practice? What do we mean when we talk about rivalry between powers? So in pre-imperialist times, it was about status. Now, status in the sense it existed then gives nothing. In the times of imperialism, rivalry meant a fight for markets. The country that won that rivalry could export its goods to the markets of third countries and tie the economy to its own. And now we live in the era of free trade, and so do businesses of great countries compete in the region? For the most part, no. Because small and medium businesses do not compete at all, and big businesses sometimes compete, but in general, there is a larger division of spheres of interest. For example, Chinese companies are active in building cheap infrastructure. Japanese companies focus on high quality infrastructure. Indian companies are building digital infrastructure, but in general, their projects are concentrated mainly in spheres of finance and light industry. Rather, from my point of view, of course, we are witnessing a symbiosis between the businesses of great power. Because where Chinese corporations are laying down infrastructure, Indian small and medium enterprises are emerging. And we can analyze, for example, East African crude oil pipeline, EACOP. In its construction, Chinese, European, Australian companies were involved for varying degrees. In fact, the economic rivalry between the great powers in the region now means rivalry for individual projects, and China is clearly winning in this, since the Chinese economy is now interested in exporting capital. Often this export is perceived as state-directed, as part of grand design, and we can see this is often, from our point of view here in Russia, it's a chaotic process. This is largely inspired from below, because Chinese firms are trying to move capital abroad and seek to enlist the support of the state. They usually use the rhetoric as a Belt and Road initiative and something like that. It's understandable and close to authorities. And as a result, Chinese economic projects are perceived from the outside as in a quite distorted way, because their successes are obvious, but their failures are not visible. And so classic example is the case of Hambantota port, because we already know that the lion's share of loans that the Rajapaksa's government used to build Hambantota were not Chinese. So we know that the initiative to build a port in this area was Rajapaksa's own idea and was caused by internal reasons because he wanted to improve the living conditions of his hometown. We know that the Chinese ended up leasing Hambantota for a small sum because the port was not really needed in the Colombo context. In fact, even the United States and China are hardly economic rivals in the true sense of the word, because until recently the economies were so closely linked that we saw there was talk about G2 or Chimerica format. And now this idea has been shelved, of course, but despite all the loud phrases about decoupling, American companies are still operating in China and are not in any hurry to move production to other countries. In fact, we are witnessing a continuing growth and interdependence between all great powers in the region, albeit in different forms, of course. And this interdependence cannot be shaken by any political issues. And after the conflict in Ukraine began, for example, European countries and the United States imposed sanctions on Russia, stopping buying oil from it directly. But this led only to one result, because they continue to buy oil from Russia only through laundromats. And their governments pretend that Russian undemocratic oil becomes democratic after refining in Indian democratic refineries, or after adding a drop of Saudi democratic oil. So during the Cold War, a great power rivalry was fueled by ideological difference. Now there is no particular ideological difference because, yeah, Chinese regime is special. In the West, it's called authoritarian, totalitarian. In China itself, it's called a people's democracy. And in any case, it doesn't resemble the Westminster system, but China is not trying to export it as the Soviet Union tried to do. In China and in the United States and in India, in Japan and Russia, the economy is essentially capitalist, with varying degrees of paternalism. So I cannot see any ideological rivalry in the region. And in fact, the entire discourse of great power rivalry is supported by the governments, so the political military elites and expert community that serves them, and the media, of course. Of course, by urbanized middle class, which is always more interested in foreign policy issues than any other part of society. In fact, it's within the framework of perception and transmission of the views of these social groups, so this discourse of great power rivalry exists. And this discourse is different in each country, because in the United States, there is a growing idea of inevitable clash with China, and mentally, this concept completely repeats the scenario of Japanese attack in the beginning of Second World War. It's implied that China will attack either the United States or Japan or any United States allies, and the United States will intervene or win, of course. And this idea is actively sought after by the American middle class, is supported by the writers, by the media, by the authors of coffee table books. Well, every year a bunch of paperbacks editions are published in which the future war is described. For intellectuals, there is another product, for example, discussions about the Thucydides trap and all that. In fact, so Western military experts with a magnifying glass are looking for any signs of growth of Chinese naval power and are trying to find among Chinese thinkers a Chinese Mechan who could inspire the emergence of Chinese Yamamoto in a way familiar to Western mind. But in China, things are viewed very differently because no one is going to repeat the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor or attacks or the United States Navy. because United States Navy is significantly superior in the combat capabilities to Chinese Navy. In essence, the Chinese approach boils down to defending its territorial claims as much as possible, nine-dash line, disputed talents, and so on. So, striving to do business in the entire region and numerous complaints about United States attempts to hinder Chinese growth. It's not a fact that the situation will not change, of course, because Chinese are actively absorbing the Western military theory. So I was surprised when I visited Shanghai last year. So there are a lot of Western military theory books translated into Chinese. So it's in fact dozens of them. So they are sold everywhere, and there is a risk that sooner or later this will affect the situation, affect the Chinese minds. But for now, the maximum Chinese military activity is local exercises and single submarine trips to the Indian Ocean, and one little base in Djibouti, of course. And finally, India. So there is the idea of Chinese string of pearls, Chinese plans to strangle India in the possible conflict. Obviously, this is, from my point of view, is absolutely a hypothetical scenario, since in order for China to achieve any success in the fight against India in the Indian Ocean, it needs to transfer its entire navy there, which will also have to be supplied through the Straits of Malacca. And there are no guarantees of victory, since India has coastal-based missile complexes, base aviations, other means. In fact, China now has just one base in Indian Ocean, in Djibouti, and this base cannot be compared with the American base in Diego Garcia, either in size or in equipment. So it's impossible to conduct full-fledged operations based on, well, this point, which means that the Chinese threat to the Indian Ocean is, I can repeat it, is hypothetical. India is actively building the navy and strengthening the Andaman position. In fact, in a sense, this is something like the risk theory and TPS strategy, with only one difference, but very prominent difference, because India, not China, is an advantageous strategic position. At the same time, the Indian authorities are extremely sober in their assessment of the situation and understand that they have lived side by side with China for several thousand years. And despite all problems, well, they will continue to do so. So the American approach to the problem is alien to India. And so the elites of one great power are afraid for position of this, so its position, the elites of the second are concerned with the local problems, the elites of the third so use imaginary construct to solve these problems. And all this look like a situation in which the outbreak of conflict is not very likely from my point of view, but this is not a reason to calm down, because the decision to start a conflict is made not by businessmen, by the political and military elites. And the more there is talk about that the rivalry can escalate into war, the greater likelihood to war. And the more unilateral formats are created to contain in China, the greater the likelihood of conflict, because it becomes more difficult to control the actions of aggressive junior commanders who want to prove themselves and are confident that the big daddy will step in for them if necessary. The problem of actions of the ground is generally one of the most acute, so they have repeatedly led to unwanted conflict and incidents throughout history. And I can remind the most recent example in Galvan Valley, where the actions of local Chinese border commander led to bloody clash, and in fact led to the problems in bilateral relations between India and China for 5 years. This could easily happen with any European, Australian, any other ship. In this respect, people are the same, and junior and mid-level officers are the same to a greater extent. So, what about Russia? It's a great power, a nuclear power, of course, but although Russia generally recognized as a great power, it's a not great power in the Pacific, because Russia has no industrial base in the region, no shipbuilding base, has great population deficit. Military, it's very weak in the region. The Pacific Fleet, for example, excluding strategic nuclear submarines, is inferior even to the Japanese self-defense forces. And at the same time, Russia, under sanctions, is now turning to the east. So it's most actively interested in the region, being calm and business-like. and the rivalry between the great powers being minimized. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Kupriyanov. No, sorry, I'm sorry for the pronunciation. It's all right. For highlighting the status of all the players in the region, Russia, China, US, India, and you have, looked into different aspects. I mean, how they can, what is their status at the moment, and what is their different kind of strength, weaknesses as well. So thank you so much. Now the first panelist, meanwhile, he has arrived. So may I now request Dr. Roger Kangas to start his presentation. Dr. Roger Kangas is an academic dean at Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies, United States. So, Dr. Kangas, over to you. This virtual floor is all yours. Just 10 minutes. We have 10 minutes for the presentation.
Indeed. Well, thank you so much. And apologies for the late arrival. I know we were having some technical issues on the various Zoom chat rooms, so it looks like we're all now here in the same place. And actually, I feel fortunate that I had a chance to follow Alexey's presentation because a number of the things he said are points that I would have raised and are points that I agree with in terms of how we perceive or frame great power competition. So first, just to get started again, I thank you all for hosting this event for NIICE, for putting this rather complex two-day event together. The panels all work in, and I think, a really interesting mosaic of topics and perspectives. I will say from my vantage, not just coming from the US, but the Near East South Asia Center, which is a US government entity. I'll have to use the disclaimer. The views I express are my own and not that of the NESA Center or the US government, but that's fine. And I'm also happy to answer any questions on points I've raised or points perhaps I don't raise, given the time limit. And I should say, given the time limit, and especially given what we've just heard, I want to raise three quick points and then really turn it to the other speakers and then beyond for our discussion. And the first is when we look at this issue of great power competition, and I do think it's an important term to bring up, but we also have to reimagine it. Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely one who believes we have long since passed. In fact, I'm not even sure if we ever really had a so-called unipolar moment. We're in a multipolar phase, or what I sometimes suggest is a non-polar phase. Because given the subregions, given the areas of the world, certain countries are engaged, others are not. Some countries focus primarily in the Western Hemisphere, others in Europe and Africa, Latin America. So the Asia-Pacific states, we really have to look at who's engaged within this region and why. I will say, and this is a reality, in the US, we're definitely looking at a change. And, obviously with what's happened last month with the election of Donald Trump for a second non-consecutive term, the second time in US history this has happened, we're going to see some of our perceptions of great power competition challenged. You just have to go back to his first administration and look at how he framed issues. And yes, there is a notion of targeting specific states. Our colleague from Russia knows full well that we look at Russia through a particular lens, and obviously the conflict in Ukraine. We look at China as the so-called near-peer competitor. I don't think that perspective will change. And then you look at what I consider to be episodic challenges or challenges of a specific nature, Iran, North Korea, and we can look at others. What I would say in this context is we're seeing the US broadly, not just the president, not just, Donald Trump and his perspective, but I would argue a greater share of the American population is increasingly looking away from the so-called, global policeman or the approach of the US as an actor that engages throughout the world, that starts forever wars, and is rethinking where it's positioned. As I look at the past years, and I can see, the administrations of George Herbert Walker Bush, of Bill Clinton, George W. Bush as kind of the prime example of the post-Cold War globalist approach to security. So all the issues of rules-based order, Western-framed security organizations or economic organizations in many ways were at their height, even using the United Nations to promote certain views. I even look at the so-called freedom agenda of George W. Bush, right? This was the view that somehow democratization, Western approaches would develop in other parts of the world. This is part of our engagement. Interestingly, we can almost go back to the 2008 economic crisis, a retrenchment in a number of European countries, in the US, about where we prioritize our resources. But you almost see the succession of administrations. I look at it in my country from Obama to Trump, yes to Biden, now back to Trump, as ones that are more inward looking. And you look at their narratives, yes, they did raise issues of foreign policy and security policy, but so much more of their discourse is on internal issues, on domestic issues. And we take a step further, I would say, in Trump 2.0, and we're going to see very much this, so-called America First approach of national policy. What does this mean? Pure and simple, it means focusing on the homeland, on the economy, on our borders. You look at the Heritage Foundation Project 2025, it's publicly accessible. I would read this. It is a roadmap for a number of key officials within the Trump administration. Will all of it be carried out? No, but a significant portion at least is aspired by the administration, and so much of it focuses on economics, demographics, and security as narrowly defined as security in the borders. And so what does this mean for foreign adventures? It means we'll be selectively engaged. Just look at Trump's comments on Syria. That's not our problem. These are the sorts of challenges we'll have. So as kind of a final thought, I would say, when I look at, a great power competition is in a non-polar world. We're going to be looking at national interest. I'll say, looking ahead, if I'm examining where the US will play in the Asia-Pacific space, and also what could be priorities, it's going to be on economics, economics, economics. And in particular, the rivalry or competition, if we'll use that word, with China. Again, I appreciate the previous comments because I do believe we have two countries that are linked together. Yes, there are efforts to de-risk. That's the phrase or term of art. There's a saber rattling on things like tariffs and trade limits, etc. We'll see how these go. I look at this sometimes as the opening salvos in a negotiation. And you're going to present extreme positions and somehow work to the middle. Because in all of this, I do see the chance for not just competition, but cooperation. And don't be fooled that, these are not ideological divides. These are rather divides on views of one's role in the region and one's role, if you will, as a national power. If the US is less concerned about being a global policeman, perhaps it will focus more on some of these, if you will, domestic challenges that have international implications, trade being the most important. And so it really is going to be based on how we frame this. And I will make, as I close, an important comment, that is, any prediction about what's going to happen in the next few years for the US, particularly as it relates to the Asia-Pacific space and also its view as a so-called great power in a competitive space, take with some caution. We have yet to see who the players are going to be. I was speaking with a number of Chinese academics the other week, and as we look at the appointments of certain individuals, Mark Rubio as Secretary of State, Waltz as the National Security Advisor, these are China hawks. These are people who are hard on China. Trump is that as well, but he also is looking for an opportunity to make a so-called deal that could be beneficial for the US, and that's something you'll want to think about. So when I look at competitive spaces, increasingly I'm going to tell the audience, and I'll be curious what the next speakers have to say, how other countries step up in the region, India among them. But how do we look at multinational organizations, ASEAN, SCO, you name it? I think these are increasingly going to be important in the region. And so just to close, I'll leave with looking ahead with three quick thoughts. If we only look at the region through great power competition, we do this at our peril. We need to expand really and reframe how we look at countries interacting in the region. And while it sounds idealistic, I may say that there are going to be local and regional elements of cooperation. We need to take our 20th century terms and move them into the 21st century. Secondly, US, China, clearly competitive, but don't rule out the possibility of even some, at least hoped for aspired summit. President Trump invited Xi Jinping to his inauguration. Of course, it's not going to be carried out, but don't expect that to be the last effort to engage or interact. And then thirdly, we are going to have to look for wild cards in the region. I made reference to Syria. For Middle East watchers, of course, that was a surprise. What we saw in Bangladesh months ago, again, a surprise, at least to a number of outside observers. Could we see other crises or other wild card events that may shape how large powers interact with each other in the Asia-Pacific space? Absolutely. I'll leave it at that. I look forward to hearing what our other speakers have to say and for the questions and comments from the audience. So again, thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kangas. In a very concise manner, you highlighted many aspects of the rivalry in the Indo-Pacific, especially what has been U.S. Position and what is likely to be with the new presidency, especially the unpredictability part that is attached to it. So thank you so much. Moving on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Pascal. He is a senior researcher at Peace Research Institute, Frankfurt, Germany. To show Dr. App, over to you. This virtual floor is all yours now.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. So I wanted to start by offering a few thoughts on competition in the Indo-Pacific region and what distinguishes competition from either conflict or cooperation. And then thought you might also be interested in a European perspective on how these processes are playing out locally. So to start off, there are certainly reasons to look on competition in the Indo-Pacific region with worry. So reasons to believe that it might tilt into open conflict. As was already pointed out, the region is the primary arena for the US-China rivalry. This, I think, is a trend in international relations that's going to be permanent. There's very little that is still keeping this competition from maybe shifting back into cooperation, but several reasons for why it might turn into conflict, or in the words of Graham Allison, why these two countries may be destined for war. As was already pointed out, the region is multipolar in nature. We know that this is a general setup in IR that is relatively conflict prone when you have multiple great powers competing with each other. And certainly beyond just the US and China, as was already said, India is a very big player there. Japan is getting more and more involved. And to some degree, even though I would not describe the European agency as that of a great power, there's also increasing engagement there. When you look at geopolitical flashpoints, so although, of course, Ukraine and Gaza have grabbed the spotlight in recent years, there is still a multitude of them that might spark a direct US-China confrontation, most notably, of course, Taiwan, but also the South China Sea, in addition to a number of others. So, for example, the India-Pakistan rivalry, the border clashes between India and China that we saw in Galwan Valley in 2021, a still divided Korea. And of course, there are many open domestic conflicts that sometimes do not just breed domestic instability, but can also spill out into other countries. The most intense, of course, being the ongoing civil war in Myanmar, but also crisis of government and government changes in other countries like Bangladesh and previously large-scale unrest in Sri Lanka. There's also a relatively low institutionalization. So if you think that institutions are at least giving stability, predictability, and structure, and also keeping conflicts in check, then it is actually amazing how little there is beyond ASEAN, which is a relatively well institutionalized and deepened regional organization. There just isn't much in this region. And as we have seen, while institutions may not be able to prevent conflicts, like, for example, the one in Ukraine, they certainly offer a forum, at least for dialogue, and to maybe keep impulses that might otherwise result in open conflict in check. So, having gone through this list of factors to be concerned about, however, there are also some that, at least to me, are reason to believe that the future might be more peaceful than some people are expecting. And one of them is the fact that in the Indo-Pacific, there is actually so much to compete over. If you look at that, it is not just home to the majority of the world's population, but also the emerging economic power center of the world. So where growth is really being generated. Alexey already mentioned that the countries in the region are driven ideologically by varieties of capitalism. I would maybe put it slightly differently and say that it is varieties of developmentalism. So the predominant interest for just about every country in the region, maybe with the exception of some extreme cases like North Korea, is in economic development. And there's also a shared understanding, I believe, that this economic development is based on some variant of globalization, of ongoing free trade, of the complex supply chains that have just enabled this region really to jumpstart its own development and to become this highest growth region in the world. Second, there is a tendency to view this issue of competition through a great power lens and to only look at the agency of those great powers. And I think that is wrong. If you turn it around and see how the agency of non-great powers in the region has really changed by the fact that great powers are competing over them for their allegiance, for local influence, for also rights to participate in economic development, then this is really something which is strengthening their leverage in international negotiations. And it is upon external great powers actually to make the most compelling offer when it comes, for example, to infrastructure development. There was China's BRI, and then other countries noticed, okay, this is something we have to compete with. We need to make our own offers. That was really the origin of some of the new programs that you've been seeing, like the European Global Gateway, the Build Back Better World initiative, or before that, the Japanese Agenda for Free and Open Indo-Pacific, which is closely linked with its high-quality infrastructure drive. So it's really in the developmental field where I think local states can leverage this position as takers into a stronger position now. And I think there is this also showcases an awareness that the most desirable future for the region is one of interconnectedness. And all of these form inhibiting factors for conflict, really. There's a shared interest to keep this competition at the level at which it is, maybe to leverage the positive aspects, and certainly to establish so-called guardrails to keep it from going into open, even military conflict. So to tell you a little bit about how European countries and also the European Commission are looking on this region, I think it's again important to review that Europe is not a great power. It does not understand itself as a great power, and due to the fact that it is made up of many, many different countries, none of which themselves qualify as great powers, in my opinion, it could not play this role even if it wanted. But in a sense, this is also something which is not just shaping how it views the region, but also shaping its own sense of what kinds of competitive strengths and weaknesses it has there. First of all, I think the European awareness of the region is starting with the fact that much of the world's future will be decided in this region. So this is how virtually all of the Indo-Pacific agendas that you are now seeing being published frame this whole issue. And the second one is that the region is as much a field of or a zone of opportunity as it is a zone of risk. So when you look again at, for example, opportunities for also European companies to increase their profits, to diversify, for example, their supply chains, this is really the primary lens to which they're looking at the region. There is a clustering of emerging and already developed economies in this region. And this kind of acknowledgement of the enormous success which many states, not just China, but also, for example, India and much of Southeast Asia have already had in lifting really enormous numbers of people out of poverty and giving them middle-class status is very much being acknowledged and is being seen as a great success, actually, of globalization and of development policy. Now, if you look at how competition shapes the European role in the region, I would raise 3 points here. The first one is that the ongoing, especially US-China rivalry there is also an opportunity to engage like-minded partners. So like-minded, maybe not in the sense that they share the same regimes or that they espouse always the exact same values as European countries internationally, but at least that they have a shared interest in also preserving their own agency in this area of great power competition. So not to be subsumed in the kind of bloc confrontation that we had in the Cold War, but to remain to a great degree independent. Another point is that there is, I think, a shared interest in that the rules that are governing international interactions also are designed often to the benefit actually of smaller countries. So great powers are the ones who can break rules, sometimes with impunity. They are also certainly the ones who have the greatest temptation to do so, whereas smaller powers are the ones who really benefit from the kind of predictability that rules generate. And this is also, I think, where there's an awareness in the region that the European Union has some credibility, especially when it comes to standing up for international law and for working towards a juridification of international relations. In an increasingly divided world, that is also something that's keeping it together. The second one is, I think, a shared interest in the diversification of economic linkages. So the agenda that is being described as de-risking, I think it was actually the European Commission who originated that term, and now others are taking it up as well, is an agenda that's primarily pursued through diversification of economic linkages. So the sense that it is bad for one's own international agency if you're too economically dependent in trade links to one single country, that is actually what's driving economic investment from European countries in regions like South and Southeast Asia nowadays. And finally, so when you look at the Indo-Pacific and how it's being debated, security issues are very much at the forefront, I think, of thinking certainly in China, in the United States, certainly also in India, of course, and maybe for Russia, the same thing goes. But for European countries, there's still a sense that our agency is primarily economic in nature. It may not be able to achieve quite as much as we used to think it could. Basically that this kind of economic agency can always be a force for peace and that it can bolster cooperation. It's an agenda which, of course, saw a massive setback with the outbreak of war between Russia and Ukraine. But there is a sense still that when looking at what Europeans can do to stabilize the region, that of course, there's some security engagement as well, but these are mostly tokenistic efforts. And I think the biggest move that we can make is to raise the point that our interests are also intricately linked with this region, and that anybody who would start a war there would also jeopardize those interests and then have to face the brunt, for example, of economic sanctions. I think that is the biggest actual deterrent that the European side can make, and to make also a contribution for a positive and peaceful future of this region. I'm going to leave it there. If you're interested in more details on Indo-Pacific strategies of Germany or other European countries, please feel free to raise them in the Q&A. And now I'm looking forward to what the speakers have to say. Thank you very much again.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Ebb. Very nicely, presented many aspects, but what I appreciate more is the European perspective, because the European Union is also having some, it has some footprint in in this Indo-Pacific region as well. Looking at your presentation, what I just understood, that there are European Union is looking at the opportunities rather than the risk, and especially to diversify the supply chains. That initiatives, different initiatives that the European Union and member states have taken in this region, and no doubt the economic part will definitely be there, and many companies, many players, state and non-state actors, private players also, they are European private players are also already, they have started doing different activities in the Indo-Pacific region, whether that is connectivity or laying the submarine cables, etc. So the economic part will definitely be there, but at the same time, maybe we may see more security aspects also. The European Union may look at the security aspects in future also. So thank you so much. Now, our next speaker, Professor Shahab E. Khan. Professor Khan is Chief Executive Officer of Bangladesh Center for Indo-Pacific Affairs. So, Professor Khan, over to you.
Thank you very much. Am I audible?
Yes,
Please bear with me, because
yes,
I'm sitting in a public place and you might hear a lot of unwanted noise. Apologies for that. I have just come out from one meeting and stepping into another meeting in 10 minutes of time. Thank you very much. I think this is an outstanding conversation that I was listening to, particularly what Alexey and my good old friend Roger and Pascal, Mr. Pascal, has talked about. And I think the whole idea of great power game has become quite a narrative in this part of the world. So I will limit myself to the South and Southeast Asian landscape rather than looking or stretching myself to other regions. And I think that itself deserves a long conversation. And I think the two clear issues that came up from my previous speakers is that the great power game, whether we accept them as a multipolar entity or we accept them no polar entity or perhaps bipolar entity, but in any case, the whole term of polar is going to be there. And that itself shows that the international relations or international security environment is not going to get away from the polarization anytime soon. Shall that be seen through the prism of trade or security or even institutional approaches towards international relations or our relations with the bilateral, trilateral, multilateral, or even the fancy term, the minilateral. One quick point, which I fully agree with Roger, when he talked about the relationship between the US and China and the term competitiveness. I mean, from Bangladesh's point of view, if you look at our last 10 years of foreign policy, at least I have extensively written about it and spoke at length at the NESA Center, that the global politics is heavily shaped by how the US and China will behave against each other in the coming years. Very much related to the supply chain. If you look at the countries like Bangladesh, alike, the heavy reliance on the supply chain is originated in China. And the demand side of Bangladesh's economy output is largely in the Middle East and the Europe and, of course, the United States and Canada. So which means many of the countries are heavily interrelated instead of, I would say, that, bypassing any kind of other regional norms, is heavily interrelated with the Chinese economy and the US economy. So therefore, any kind of competition has a repercussion on the economies like ours. This is one. The second thing, whether there is a potential for conflict between the US and and China, at least from our perspective, we do agree that the new Trump administration's assumption of power might come with a new reconfiguration in the global politics as well as the US's foreign policy towards the Indo-Pacific. But most certainly, both China and United States under the Trump presidency will try to avoid any kind of military or strategic escalation, rather than they will keep themselves confined within the trade war and so on. So therefore, that kind of competition, if I see it from a small power perspective or small country perspective, I think is not necessarily a very bad idea, but certainly we have to be very, very careful when it comes to countries like ours. The second important issue that Roger brought out, and I think this is very interesting when he mentioned that the Yemen was a surprise and Bangladesh was surprised. Absolutely. And if you look at now Bangladesh's relationship with the global powers as well as the regional neighbors is fundamentally going through changes, fundamental changes. And that allows many other countries to follow the suit. And that's what we are going to see in the coming years. That's why when he mentioned about Yemen or Bangladesh, I couldn't resist but to add here that we are going to see a lot of surprise coming from Myanmar too. So if you look at Bangladesh-Myanmar border is no longer the same border that we used to see since last week, because now the border is controlled by the Arakan army, not by the state any longer. So we now have two borders. One is with India. The other one is Myanmar. With India, we have a state-to-state border relationship. And now we are reconfiguring our understanding that what kind of border relationship we have with Myanmar, because essentially the whole border is now controlled by non-state actor, some would say ethnic armed group, or whichever way we put it. So we are now seeing a new kind of border relationship is emerging in our neighborhood. Shall we be surprised to see that this whole border configuration will lead to a new kind of changes in Myanmar? That's probably going to happen in a few years of time. So this is another part of the whole story. Then when we look into our Indo-Pacific approach, particularly Bangladesh's Indo-Pacific approach, we do have our Indo-Pacific outlook. I was in Paris last week, and this whole discussion about the French Indo-Pacific strategy aligns with very much with Bangladesh's understanding of Indo-Pacific strategy. Here, the problem is that the Indian understanding of Indo-Pacific, or perhaps the Japanese understanding of Indo-Pacific, and in that case, the US understanding of Indo-Pacific largely varies. And that's where I think one of the critical issue that all these countries will eventually have to come in terms is to harmonize their understanding of the Indo-Pacific region, whether we should heavily focus on the economics, we should focus on trade, or we should bring the security concerns or strategic security concerns in the forefront of our relationship will essentially be a determinant of how the Indo-Pacific region will behave or will remain stable in the coming years. So I think one of the critical feature that we are going to see in the coming months, or perhaps months might be too sooner, in the coming years, is to see that how these major players in international politics and international power game will be acting with each other on the basis of their interest. Now, if you look at the French one, I mean, it has a huge maritime territory, overseas territory. On the other hand, the United States has a huge overseas maritime presence, and the Chinese are escalating their presence to a very rapid scale. So what it means is that again, how will we manage the institutional approach towards governing the Indo-Pacific will also be a big concern. At least my understanding of power lies in three fundamental characteristics: whether a country has the ability to change international institutions, whether the country has ability to alter international system, or whether a country has the ability to provide alternative solutions to the existing institutions. And I think if you take these three perimeters, the Chinese, the Americans, and most certainly the Russians have done considerable, has provided considerable exposure of their capabilities. And hence, that's why we are also seeing that there is a demand coming up for an alternative institutions. Look at BRICS, look at now the conversation on trilateralism or minilateralism in different places, essentially also creates some sort of uneasiness for the countries which are middle power or the smaller, to really see what kind of choice, rational choice we will have when it comes to the existing institutional setup against the alternative institutional setups being proposed by the countries like BRICS and so on. So therefore, my understanding of Indo-Pacific certainly shows that we have, while we have a tremendous potential, and if I see it from the South Asian perspective, the least integrated region in the world compared to Southeast Asia. They do have 25% intra-regional trade. We have less than 5% inter-regional trade, making us much more dependent or interdependent or perhaps complex dependent on Chinese or Americans or Russians or the external powers. Now, that makes another case for us to really think about. And I think this is a great platform where I would definitely be proposing the South Asians and Southeast Asians to really look for a common economic understanding of the Indo-Pacific region. Otherwise, I think the whole great power competition, or beyond the great power competition, if we look into our own economic structures, we will always be in the passive side of globalization. So my two proposals, the first one is that the Southeast and South Asian countries must strengthen their regional institutions. We want to create a resilience against the shocks. And the second is that we need to harmonize our understanding of Indo-Pacific, be it in alignment with the US or France or Japan or China, whichever it is. Then I think we will have a greater framework of cooperation and resilience against another kind of geopolitical, geostrategic, or to say the least, geoeconomic shocks. Thank you very much with that, please.
Thank you, Professor Khan. I must say, very nicely presented the views, especially your last two observations, how we need to strengthen our regional institutions to enable our countries, South Asian countries, for resilience, and also harmonize understanding about the Indo-Pacific, that is need of the hour. But also, you also highlighted what has been Bangladesh approach to the Indo-Pacific, and in the way it wants to balance its relations with major powers like India, China, and the United States, while prioritizing economic development, connectivity, maritime security. So really appreciate that. Now moving to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Uma Purushothaman. Dr. Purushothaman is an associate professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Over to you, Dr. Uma.
Thank you, Dr. Shakti. He's also my colleague, so special thanks. First of all, thank you, Dr. Pramod and NES for inviting me for this conference. The topic that I was given to speak really was great power competition in the Indo-Pacific. But I thought I need to kind of tweak this title into major power competition in the Pacific, because if you look at the theoretical definition of great powers, other than the US, China, and perhaps Russia, China and Russia, I don't think the other powers involved are really great powers if you go by the theoretical definition. And I just want to use this definition which von Drake had used in 1833, that a great power must be able to maintain itself against all others, even when they are united. And by that reasoning and definition, I think my own country, as well as several powers in the Indo-Pacific, would not make the cut. Though, of course, their capabilities are increasing pretty fast, and they may well reach the status of great powers soon. That said, what I intend to do over the next 10 minutes is kind of very quickly outline some of the elements of great power competition, including some of the strategies of the major powers, and look at the challenges associated with this competition and the implications of this competition, both in theoretical and practical terms. One, of course, I think we have heard ad nauseum about what the United States is doing in terms of its Indo-Pacific strategy, the idea of freedom of navigation, and then the alliances that is building, or the partnerships that it is building through the AUKUS and the Quad, the economic frameworks that it's been building, and the fact that it still has a huge military presence in the Indo-Pacific region, whether it is the US bases in Guam, Japan, South Korea, and the kind of naval operations that it has been undertaking in the South China Sea. Then, of course, in terms of the competition with China in trade and supply chains, and in this competition, in this rivalry between the United States and China in the Indo-Pacific, the US has a huge advantage because it has this enduring network of alliances, and among whom they have developed habits of cooperation. So the US has that advantage over the Chinese. In response to the United States' idea of free and open Indo-Pacific, the Chinese have come up with this idea of the community of common destiny, that mankind has a shared future. I'm not sure it received a lot of traction, but still that's what the Chinese have come up with. The other thing we must remember is that as far as the Chinese are concerned, if you look at how the Chinese have responded to the idea of the Indo-Pacific, whether they have been extremely hostile to the concept because they view it as an attempt by the Americans and American allies, as well as partners like India, to contain its rise. And that's why you will never see the Chinese using the term Indo-Pacific in their official documents. As far as strategies go, the Chinese have come up with, of course, the Belt Road Initiative. That's not only meant for the Indo-Pacific, but Indo-Pacific is a large focus there. They have been modernizing their military in terms of whether it is in the South China Sea. They've been expanding their naval capabilities. They've been pursuing dual-use port projects. They have been investing quite substantially in Southeast Asia and Africa. But what you would notice in how the United States and China, the difference is that China's concept or its framework for its activities in the Indo-Pacific is much looser and more complicated. It has much looser and more complicated relationship with the major powers in the region. And so what it has been doing is it's been trying to kind of build on multilateral regional forums like the APEC or the East Asia Summit or the ASEAN +3 Summit and the China-ASEAN Forum. And as far as the Chinese are concerned, these kinds of non-binding strategic partnerships allows it to engage selectively with some of the countries in the region, and they will not, translate into coalitions for deep strategic goals. So my sense is that the Chinese do not seem to be very enamored with the idea of alliances like the United States is. It could also probably be because the Chinese are not very good at building alliances, or they cannot kind of push the narrative like the United States can, in the sense that it's already vilified in a lot of media. But then I still feel the Chinese do not give in to the idea of alliances very easily. I think it's not something that they're very enamored with. They're not very enthusiastic about it. As far as the Russians are concerned, I think compared to the United States and China, the Russian strategic interests and capabilities in the Indo-Pacific are much lower than those of China and the United States. So while the Russians have been saying that they want a greater role in the Indo-Pacific, there are a couple of reasons which constrain its ability to influence the region. And this is particularly because of the focus on the West after the annexation of Crimea and the war with Ukraine. The second thing is that the Russian Far East still remains underdeveloped. Russia was trying to develop it, but it is going to take some more time to generate capabilities there. As far as Japan is concerned, they are worried about the rise of China, of course, and despite being an economic powerhouse, they do not have, the military wherewithal as such. So they have been having these debates on military expansionism, etc. Now, when you come to India, India has been balancing non-alignment and alignment in terms of its participation with the Quad. It has brought in its own maritime security initiative. It has talked about an Indo-Pacific initiative. But if you look at the initiative, it is more, the Indo-Pacific initiative is more on, marine security, ecosystems, areas where you can actually kind of collaborate with other countries. And here I want to bring to your notice that unlike the United States, which focuses only on towards India's east, India has expanded the geographical reach of the term Indo-Pacific to include the West as well, because as far as India is concerned, the Middle East is a region with profound strategic implications for India, not just strategic, but also economic implications for India. So India is trying to emphasize this balance between India's Act East and activist policy to make both of them an integral part of India's strategy in the Indo-Pacific. Now, as far as the ASEAN countries and Australia are concerned, of course, they're trying to make this balance between, on one hand, having this huge trade with the Chinese versus their economic concerns. On economic dimensions, of course, we have to see the impact of what the decoupling between the United States and China will be on regional trade, because it's not just China which is going to be affected by these trade wars and tariffs. It's also going to be third countries in Southeast Asia which could be affected by this. Then the technological competition between China and the US in terms of this race for semiconductors, AI, and 5G. And this is an area where our chair, Dr. Sakti, is an expert. He offers a course on this, I believe, technology and international relations. Anyway, to move on to soft power in terms of cultural diplomacy, the United States has been utilizing cultural exchanges, the Fulbright programs to enhance understanding. Economic engagements are there, and the Chinese are using the BRI not only as an economic strategy, but also to project their influence, and to increase interdependence, which can lead to political leverage. If you look at cultural institutions, the Chinese have also been building all these Confucius institutes worldwide. So in conclusion, I think one of the speakers before me was talking about the lack, that when we talk about great power competition, we do not talk about the smaller powers, and we behave as if they do not have agency in this. But my sense is that the countries in the Indo-Pacific do not want to be in a situation where they have to choose between the US and China. They want to have a balance which allows them to have cooperation economically with both the United States and China. And maintaining this balance is going to be the challenge for the regional countries. So there is a complex competition among the major powers, and it is intensifying. And there are elements of both economic, military, and ideological competition, which are enmeshed and intrinsic to this competition. Regional cooperation and effective diplomacy, perhaps we will have to work more on that in order to have more stability. And on one hand, while the smaller states are unhappy with the kind of competition, what is happening is that they could both engage with both the powers to maximize their own economic benefits while maintaining sovereignty. There is some potential for cooperation, particularly on issues like climate change or public health crisis. But like as someone already mentioned, the more intense the competition is, the more the risk of miscalculation and the risk of escalation. And then there is the fear of economic fragmentation if there is a de-risking or decoupling between the United States, and it's a big question what would happen what the consequences of decoupling are. And if you look at the regional polarization, you are seeing the smaller nations being caught between the major powers. So if you look at the impact of this competition, for one, you are seeing the shift away from unipolarity to multipolarity, or like Dr. Roger Kangas said, or non-polar phase. And also we are witnessing a shift from continental security in Asia to maritime security. If you look at both both China and India, for almost 30-40 years of the independence, they have focused more on the continental threat, and now they are more more focused on their maritime policies. Both of them want to become blue water navies and project power. So balancing great power interest with local autonomy, that is going to be the task for the region. And I think we are going to see more alignments than alliances. I'll come back to this at the end when I talk about the theoretical part. That the states in the region, if you look at whether it's Indonesia, whether it's India, they all value their independence, and they also want to be flexible. So they can immediately react to whatever changing dynamics are there. But the problem here is that the more flexible your foreign policy is, there is also the question of trust deficit, and that could lead to a lack of stability in the region because no one knows who's with whom. But just to come to the theoretical part, so the competition in this Indo-Pacific, the response of the middle powers and other powers in the region, China's lack of enthusiasm for alliances, and the intense desire that we see among the middle powers in the region for autonomy suggests that I think we need to consider using the term alignments instead of alliances for relations for the states in the region. And that would be a shift away from the traditional alliance structures based on military force to more, transient marriages of convenience on specific issues. So Stephen Walt defines this as alignment as a relationship between two or more states that involve mutual expectations of some degree of policy or some degree of policy coordination on security issues under certain conditions in the future. And so that means this is a much broader canvas than alliances, and this is probably what we're going to witness in more numbers in the Indo-Pacific. We are probably also going to witness more multilateralism, more institutional frameworks for cooperation among the countries in the region, not necessarily the United States or not necessarily China, but among the middle powers in the region, like Dr. Khan had mentioned. For instance, the reinvigoration of existing minilaterals could also happen, as for instance, the BIMSTEC is an idea or an organization which could probably be reinvigorated because it brings in both South and Southeast Asia. So given the complex balancing dynamics in the region, the agency of small and middle powers and major powers in the region, the current competition does not support either domination of the Americans or Chinese domination in the Indo-Pacific. But we will witness more unilaterals coming up. We will witness more alignments happening. So it should be interesting to see what happens. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Uma Purushothaman, for highlighting different aspects, and most importantly, the approach of different powers. You have highlighted their approach with clinical precision, I must say, and especially you have mentioned about what the approach that the small states they are going to have in the Indo-Pacific, and underscoring the strategic autonomy, balancing relations, and key and other aspects like what will be the approach with key players in this region, by which they can safeguard their national interest by building a multipolar region. But what I must say, the most important part of your discussion, your presentation was on how the alignment is going to be more important than alliances. So that's really very important observation, I must say. Thank you so much. Now we are moving to our last but not the least speaker, Gitanjali S. Roy. Gitanjali S. Roy is an assistant professor at Jindal School of International Affairs, OP Jindal Global University in India. So over to you, Gitanjali.
Thank you, Chair. A very good evening to everyone. So it's a very interesting panel that we've had. We've had the definition of great power politics, then we've got into the various, countries' perspectives. For example, we had US, we had EU, and the way, Dr. Uma concised the whole idea I think as our chair said, last but not the least. So the person who's at the last really doesn't have much to say. So I'll actually talk about not great power politics, but I'll talk about something very close to my heart, that's India-Japan relations. And how India-Japan relations can kind of pave the way for future cooperations within the Indo-Pacific. One thing I think which is very close to all of us has been medical diplomacy. During the COVID and post-COVID issues, we faced a lot of issues with regard to how everybody's had health issues. So today I will talk a little bit more on health issues, medical diplomacy, so that how Southeast Asian countries, South Asia, and even the Pacific Island countries can get that kind of help, which our chair had mentioned initially. So I like to cover those aspects because most of the aspects have been covered. So one of the key areas that India-Japan relations can look at is, for example, the autoimmune disease. During the COVID period, we did not realize that many people developed an autoimmune disease. And now they say that the autoimmune disease is the new pandemic. Specifically, it impacts children from the age of 0 to 5, and obviously, it impacts a lot of women from the age of 25 onwards, and of course, our old age people. I think one very important thing in the census which says this, or I would say the percentage as per the global population, is that pre-COVID times, there was 9% of our population which suffered from autoimmune diseases. At present, the percentage is moving from 25 to 27 with regard to the global population. And of course, Japan is a country which has a huge population. Various other countries in the Indo-Pacific region also have a huge aging population, right? And as we move, India will also have an aging population once the demographic changes takes place. So autoimmune disease is going to be one particular thing which is going to constantly impact every particular country within the broader range of the Indo-Pacific. Unfortunately, the medication that has been given with regard to the autoimmune disease is very toxic. And it has severe side effects, okay? So because of that, you end up gaining weight, you lose hair. There are many other severe side effects which are there. So one solution that rheumatologists have found with regard to autoimmune diseases has been the use of herbal components. And if I may say this, in our country, the state of Assam is in the top 35 countries in the world to have produced high quality medicinal plants and biodiversity. So what is happening is rheumatologists are finding solutions with regard to plant-based components and plant-based medicinal herbs, which are actually helping autoimmune diseases. What I suggest here with regard to autoimmune diseases, if we look at, I'm not only talking about big powers, small powers, middle powers, I'm talking about generally everybody within the Indo-Pacific should look at finding solutions to health-related issues in the future. So my suggestion here is, if India is supported by other countries, India can work with the help of other countries, specifically EU, Japan, US, and other countries from Southeast Asia, and work towards creating a component of plant-based medication for autoimmune. And while you create this thing, these particular countries together can help out more countries in Southeast Asia and the small Pacific Islands. This way, we'll be able to create, I would say, a very good combination of medication and find solutions which are more natural based. So this is a solution or a suggestion, I would say, with regard to autoimmune diseases. The other thing that I have is, unfortunately, globally, there is a rise in cancer. Okay. Indo-Pacific countries within the Indo-Pacific region are also seeing the increase in a lot of cancer cases. I'm going to give you a case study of my own country and a particular state. I'm going to talk about Assam. So Assam and the entire Northeast actually has the highest composition of cancer cases in India. In fact, as per the data, in Assam, 125 lakh population is facing the kind of case has been facing cases of cancer every year. And the Tata Trust has been creating and working on creating 17 cancer care facilities, which is a joint initiative with the government of Assam. Right now, at present, I believe, if I'm correct with the information which I read last, 7 are functioning, and they are functioning with 60% cancer care patients have been able to recover from those seven cancer care hospitals, and they have the best radiation facilities. My suggestion again here is, because there is a rise in cancer globally, okay, across, specifically, like we have so many countries within the Indo-Pacific region, we need to look at something called the community-based screening and early diagnosis. This way, we'll be able to stop and prevent cancer cases to move to stage 2 and stage 3. And also, when you have a community-based, screening, what will happen is it'll create a role model. So what will happen is, of course, the Indian government has already said that, like they have this Cancer Care Foundation in Assam, they're also looking at creating more such kind of models across India. And my suggestion is that if India can, eventually have these cancer care centers, India will not only become a cancer care hub, and these kind of models within India, which are being formed, can be further, extended to other Southeast Asian countries, South Asian countries, and even other developed nations can work towards this. Apart from cancer care, the other thing that Indo-Pacific nations, or like nations in the Indo-Pacific, are facing, of course, as I mentioned, health crisis. The problem is intensive care needs nursing. So I think one thing that we should all work towards within the broader perspective is to look at developing a proper skill set for nursing. And the same skills, I mean, and this is one suggestion with regard to skill development. The other skill development that can happen is in the domain of cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is something which is been worried about. A lot of countries today have come up with various cybersecurity strategies and initiatives, and they're constantly upgrading their cybersecurity strategies. So I think the other thing that we could do within the broader range of the Indo-Pacific is to look at how skill development can be more profitable for the person who's dealing with cybersecurity cases. The last one that I suggest, again, is in the domain of science, is nanotechnology. If we see today, various countries, the great powers, of course, are working a lot with regard to healthcare application. And I think one very important thing that we are missing is the need to have cheaper, not only medical goods, but also, equipment, which is very, very important. And that is one problem we are facing across the globe, because there is a need to have cheaper machinery. Most places, specifically the underdeveloped or the developing nations within the broader perspective of the Indo-Pacific region, many of the countries don't have proper healthcare. So if together we could work within the broader framework of the Indo-Pacific and work on these lines, a lot of, I would say, medical help can go out, specifically through the line of nanotechnology. So I think I would suggest, of course, India has a lot of, I would say India is ranked third globally with regard to nanotechnology publication. And unfortunately, we're not able to patent many things, and the marketing application is also not taking place. So if other countries can also work together in the domain of nanotechnology within the broader perspective of the Indo-Pacific, countries like, Japan can come in, US can come in, also Australia can come in, and that kind of, community can help the other countries like ASEAN and the Pacific Island nations. So these are certain things that I've suggested, and I tried to make it slightly different because our entire panel had more or less covered something. So that's my humble suggestion. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much. I really, very interesting in the sense I was highlighting the same thing from the beginning. It is not Indo-Pacific it is not only a strategic chessboard, but a microcosm of challenges and opportunities that define our globalized world. And especially the way you have highlighted some key issues which can, give opportunity for cooperation also, and that can really redefine the Indo-Pacific It is really, I really appreciate that, especially in the field of medicines, medical facilities, cybersecurity, and nanotechnology. Thank you so much. Now, our all panel, I mean, our panelists, they have done with their presentations. We have a number of questions in the chat box. I will just read out them. The first question is, how do European nations, particularly Germany, navigate the complexities of the Indo-Pacific's great power competition? And the second question is, what contributions can the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy offer to balance of power and dynamics and promote stability in the region? I think this question is directed to Dr. Pascal, if you may.
Yeah, happy to take it. I think when it comes to promoting stability, the general strategy here is not to rely on military deterrence, because that would just not match what the EU has in terms of capabilities, and especially capabilities that could be deployed in other regions of the world. I think it's more about boosting a status quo orientation on the sides of all participants in this region. And it's about seeking out a unique role that just matches the EU's general agenda and, again, capabilities, which don't lie in the military realm, but is mostly, again, about economic agency. So when you look at, for example, the security role that is a part, actually, of the Europeans' Indo-Pacific strategy, it is heavily geared towards non-traditional security. So we had an event about maritime security in India a year ago, and most of the presentations on the EU side actually revolved around, for example, anti-piracy and counterterrorism operations. So not kind of the traditional security where you're really deploying permanently major military assets and seeking to deter a state adversary. If you look at the EU's broader agenda for the Indo-Pacific, you will also see that security even is just one of 7 points. And the other ones are much, much more strongly geared towards, for example, developmental agency, about boosting connectivity in the sense of physical infrastructure, but also about digital infrastructure, cooperation in science and technology, for example, training, teaching, and also, especially when it comes to combating climate change. I think this is really going to be a focal region. So I myself, to be honest, I did not know what climate change really meant before being in Pakistan 2 years ago and then experiencing a 45-degree heat wave. This is just not something that happens in Europe. And for all of these reasons, that is, I think, also where the primary focus of the EU when it comes to the Indo-Pacific is going to remain. A kind of a predominantly economic agenda, and even in the security realm, trying to leverage the economic strengths of the EU.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Ab. The second question is from Dr. Emadul Islam. I think this question is directed to Dr. Kangas, if we may. I think there are 2 questions. One is in the context of great power competition within the Indo-Pacific economic framework, what strategies can emerging powers like India and Indonesia adopt to enhance their economic influence and ensure secure, resilient supply chains in the Indian Ocean region? And the second one is, how can they leverage their strategic positions and growing economic clout to balance the interest of major powers while fostering regional cooperation and stability?
Okay, no, excellent questions, and honestly, I think some of our colleagues can chime in on this as well, because I think a theme that a number of the presentations raised is, while we can look at so-called great powers and say, well, US this or China that, ultimately we're actually talking about a range of powers, and I agree that increasingly we have to look at not even just regional actors, but I think are the contributions on what the Europeans can do is a great example of other external actors of different sizes playing a role. And so for all of that, and this is, I think, a challenge in the region, is when we look at the supply chains, when we look at different commodities, my worry is we're increasingly going to frame things in bilateral ways. And I know, this is an approach we see out of China. This could be an approach increasingly we'll see out of the US, where our preference is to look at US-India relations, US-Bangladesh relations, US-Sri Lanka relations. In terms of, if you want to say, simplistic mercantilist economics, that's the way to go. But I think what it does is it actually challenges this very issue of supply chains and also of comparative advantages of different countries. We end up working in separate spaces. So, my strong advocacy, just on a personal level, is for regional cooperative efforts. The efforts we see, for example, that are led by countries, like Japan, South Korea, others. We look at regional cooperation in terms of economic supply chains for countries to work with each other. And I think this is going to be particularly advantageous for Southeast Asian states, a number of smaller countries that, quite frankly, will benefit by working collectively. I will say from a corporate level in the US, there are a number of companies that still prefer this. And I think the challenge we're going to see is how the various trade balances, tariff wars, etc., may develop. And again, as I noted earlier, may not. I think some of this is also a bargaining issue. So a lot to say on that. And I would say increasingly, and this is just my last point on this, is when we look at engagement of countries in the region, and there's a statistic that I was sort of kept in the back of my mind. If you look at, say, a country like Afghanistan, which I know right now is a pariah state, we don't recognize what's going on in terms of we don't recognize the government in Kabul, but it is a reality. If you go back to the early 2000s, the collective aid budgets and foreign direct investment opportunities of countries working in Afghanistan were overwhelmingly European and American, well over 70%. Towards the end of the international engagement in that country, 2001, so 3 years ago, it was reversed. It was South Asian states, East Asian states, Middle Eastern countries. We haven't really even mentioned those, but the countries from the Gulf, GCC that is, were more significant investors. We've already seen a shift in supply chains. We've already seen a shift in the capacity of countries to have foreign direct investment in other states. It isn't because the Europeans and the Americans left. It's because other countries became much more involved. I'm curious if this can happen in other spaces in Southeast Asia in particular. And I know, when Shahab Khan mentioned Myanmar, this is a country that we could see potential investment down the road if there's some sort of change or opening. And so I just throw this out as some initial thoughts, but I hope this largely, or at least hopefully, answers the question. I will say one thing in terms of balancing powers. This is going to be part of the equation, but more it's going to be how countries can actually assert and protect their own interests. And I don't want it to all be everyone for themselves in a Hobbesian world, but I do see that countries increasingly should worry less about how do they balance against others and more about how do they, promote and defend, if you will, their own interests. But I'll leave it at that. Sir, back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Kangas. I think the next question is meant for Professor Khan, but I don't see him. Maybe again to get a different viewpoint, I mean non-South Asian viewpoint, maybe I'll go back to Dr. Ab and Dr. Kangas, how they see this particular, how does they see this particular issue. The question is, how does Bangladesh position itself in the Indo-Pacific amidst intensifying great power competition? And what role do actors like Bangladesh play in ensuring that the Indo-Pacific remains a zone of cooperation rather than conflict? If both of you can just give your own views about this particular question. That would be great. Yes, maybe we can start with Dr. Kangas. Yeah.
Okay, just a very quick thought on this, and again, it's unfortunate if Shahab's not here to follow up because he obviously would have a lot to say. Obviously the priority number one is domestic stability and a path forward towards a normalized political structure that, yes, would include elections. And I think when you look at declarations or comments made by international actors, particularly from the West, these become a priority. Not that they then become conditions for assistance and other things. We're going to see assistance in the country, but I think that's going to be all a step in the right direction. I will say, and I know, speaking with Bangladeshi colleagues on this, is it again gets to the area of regional trade and or cooperation. We think of BIMSTEC and other fora, other opportunities, which I know often people look at and say, well, these aren't really effective, but at least the vehicle is there where they could be effective. And I think for Bangladesh, it's so much is going to rely on its ability to get production levels and especially its export commodities on track. To engage with neighbors. And clearly, I would look at its relationship with India being critical, as well as the People's Republic of China, which clearly has a keen interest in what's going on in Bangladesh. And so it really is again about normalizing the domestic situation and then also reaching out to immediate neighborhoods. And I know, our Indian colleagues as well probably have some thoughts on this, but Pascal, I'll turn over to you.
So I'm not going to say anything about Bangladesh because this is just completely out of my area of expertise. I can maybe offer some more general thoughts on the part of the question that mentioned what smaller states in general can do. So the really big difference between the current era of great power competition and the Cold War is that we do not, at least not yet, have this kind of bloc confrontation that was really characteristic for the conflict back then, where you had a strong desire on the part of great powers to really tie smaller states very, very closely to themselves. And sometimes also a desire actually by smaller countries to become part of the respective camps just to have a very formal security arrangement with a patron. So I'm not seeing that nowadays. And I think really that this stresses kind of the agency which countries in the region themselves have, that they are not simply subsumed to this whole competition in the sense of purely being objects, but they have their own agency within it. So their decisions are primarily going to decide who gets to shape that region, which agenda is going to prevail. And that creates a kind of competition that really goes both ways, where again, the pressure is on external great powers to make an offer that is particularly compelling. And if it's not, then it's not going to get accepted and you're not going to play much of a role there. So that is really what smaller countries can do to keep external great powers honest and to make sure that they also pursue their competition in a way that is actually healthy, kind of the same way in which we, for example, have rules in place to ensure that competition between companies in a marketplace occurs in a way that is good for overall development. And I think that's really the biggest role, which actually not just countries like Bangladesh, but also, again, external powers like the EU that do not qualify as great powers themselves can play.
Thank you, Dr. Kangas and Dr. Air. Now the next question is, I think Dr. Uma can intervene. This question is, what role does ideology play in shaping the competition between great powers in the Indo-Pacific? And how can nations like India leverage multilateral frameworks to reduce the risks of direct confrontation between major powers? Dr. Uma?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think one of the speakers mentioned, was it Alexey, I think, mentioned the role of ideology. I honestly do not believe that ideology has any kind of role in shaping the competition among the great powers in the Indo-Pacific, because for one, I don't see China trying to export capitalism with Chinese characteristics to any part of the world. And neither do I see the United States pushing capitalism particularly under Trump. If anything, it's only going to probably push deglobalization. So I don't think ideology really has much of a role there. I mean, if you're looking in terms of theory, of course, you have, the whole structural neoliberalism, all of that. Nations like India leveraging multilateral frameworks, that's exactly what India is doing, right? India has, all kinds of multilateral frameworks, multilaterals with Southeast Asian countries. It has multilaterals with Southeast Asia as well as South Asian countries in BIMSTEC. India is part of the Quad. India is part of numerous, the Solar Alliance, all of that. So India does believe that multilateral frameworks would kind of reduce the risk of direct confrontation between major powers. But the point is, like any great power or any aspiring great power, India will do this only as long as its interests are fulfilled. The moment India itself becomes a great power, I don't think it would even think about multilateral frameworks like the United States or like China, right? So once your interests are fulfilled, there is absolutely no need for you to get into all of this. So I mean, I know it's a bit cynical, but that's my answer.
Thank you, Dr. Uma. The last question I can see in the chat box. I think Gitanjali Roy can answer this question. The question is, how does the Indo-Pacific great power competition impact non-traditional security challenges such as climate change and cybersecurity? And what strategies can academic and research institutions adopt to influence policy making in the Indo-Pacific's evolving power dynamics? Very interesting question. Yes, Gitanjali, if you can.
Sure.
Yeah.
So firstly, cyber is something I still teach in my university. Climate change, I don't, so it's wrong for me to comment on that. But I'll be very honest because the question is very directed towards how research centers and institutions can work and create something. So that's one thing that I try and do with my students is I make sure they read the original document. So when I tell them that you read the original document, one very important thing I tell them that when we studied World War, we studied the causes and the consequences, what led to it and what was the outcome. So even for a cybersecurity strategy, I mean, any document for that matter, you should understand why a particular country picked that particular strategy up. And if that particular strategy has been picked up, what are the future looking perspectives? So with regard to how policy formulations can be formed with regard to institutions and all, I think one thing we need to look at, we need to create policies which are usable. Most of the times we just give solutions which don't really result into something. It is always better, as we had a lot of conversations with regard to unilateralism and multilateralism and trilateralism. Today, when you work together, I think the answer comes in together. It'll be easy. So with regard to cyber, if I may say this, we need to look at how, if cybersecurity is an issue, how it needs to be dealt with in the future. And for that kind of thing, skill development is one thing that we need to really focus on. The second thing, apart from skill development, is continuous process of upgrading the skill development and training. Third is, after you've developed a particular person in cybersecurity and you've trained the person, what are his or her or their job opportunities in the future and how they can contribute within the broader framework, because everybody cannot work in the government, everybody cannot teach, everybody cannot be in a research setting. What are the various ways? I think this kind of awareness would actually help people, and these are the kind of answers that think tanks and institutions need to find. That is when you'll be able to create that kind of awareness and the need. So this is my submission.
Thank you, Gitanjali. I don't see more questions, so I think we can conclude now. I must say, as we conclude this insightful session on great power competition in Indo-Pacific, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to our esteemed panelists for their thought-provoking interventions, and to all of you for your active participation. And my special thanks to my friend Dr. Pramod Jaiswal and his team for organizing such an important conference. Our discussion today, it has illuminated the complexities of this dynamic region, where the interplay of great powers, continues to shape the strategic, economic, and political landscape. We have also explored not only the competition among major powers like US, China, Russia, India, but also the growing influence of middle powers and the resilience of smaller nations in asserting their agency. So key takeaways from these sessions, if I may just highlight, it includes the importance of maintaining the regional stability, fostering inclusive partnerships, and ensuring that the Indo-Pacific remains a zone of opportunity than confrontation. If I may highlight what Dr. Uma said, alignments over alliances. Lastly, I thank everybody and thank you once again for your engagement. And I look forward to continuing this important conversation in future forums as well.